I was a wise king who maintained peace throughout my reign and who managed to overcome a huge army effortlessly besides defeating a terrible illness. All this due to an important lesson that I had learned. In this video you will get to know my most valuable lesson and how to overcome all our challenges. My name is Ezekiel and this is my story. There I was, a descendant of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin at a time when the kingdom of Israel was divided. The majority united under the southern kingdom called Judah with Jerusalem as its capital, while the other tribes formed the northern kingdom based in Samaria. Unfortunately, my father was not the kind of king that God appreciated. He completely strayed from the teachings of the Lord, practicing idolatry and disrespect against the temple. It was a dark time where even the execution of my brothers happened by his hands. When I ascended to the throne at the age of 25, I decided to do things differently. I followed in the footsteps of David, my ancestor, and sought to act with honor before the Lord. I eliminated pagan places of worship, destroyed the images, and removed symbols of foreign cults. It was a time of restoration, of returning to the roots of faith that my people had abandoned. This journey was a living testimony of divine intervention in the lives of his people. From the name I bear to the decisions I made as king, it is clear that God was guiding every step of the way. And it is this faith and confidence that I continue to carry as I lead my people. Have you ever heard of Asherah, the pagan goddess of fertility? Well, she was the focus of worship in Israel, and people used to make these wooden poles, called sacred poles, in her honor. Just imagine a carved trunk to represent this fertility goddess. That was quite common back then. These places of worship for Asherah were known as groves. You know why? Because they were usually filled with trees and these carved poles where people gathered to worship. Asherah was also kind of the partner of Baal, the sun god, so imagine the combination, worship of the sun and the moon. The whole thing was a serious problem in Israel. Even though God made it clear that this wasn't okay, people kept up with this idolatry. Even Solomon, a great king, fell into this trap. He brought this Sidonian goddess, which was a form of Asherah, into the kingdom. It was a mess. And look, the situation of the Levites and the temple was terrible. The Levites were a special tribe of Israel, descendants of Levi, and were responsible for taking care of the worship in the tabernacle or the temple. But not all Levites were priests, those who could perform the specific rituals. It was a mess, but believe me, this was serious to God. He didn't like it at all, and it only brought problems for everyone. You know, sometimes history repeats itself in ways we don't expect. I remember well when my father, during his reign, closed the doors of the temple and extinguished the lamps inside. It was as if the light of faith had gone out for our people. There were no more sacrifices, no burning incense, nothing. The temple, which should have been the place of connection with God, was abandoned. But then it was my turn to take the throne, and I knew something needed to change. I saw that it was time to reopen the doors of the temple and restore its sanctity. One of the first things I did was to break into pieces that bronze serpent that Moses had made. It's ironic how something that was once a symbol of liberation became an object of worship. I realized that the tragedies that befell Judah were a consequence of our disobedience. So I decided to take a different path from my father, King Hezekiah. I called the priests and Levites to focus on their sacred duties, for the Lord had chosen them for that. After all, honoring God was the most important thing. I restored the temple and reinstated the sacrifices and burnt offerings. It was a time of gathering and celebration for Judah where everyone could turn back to God again. And to make worship even more special, I ordered the Levites to sing David's praise psalms. It wasn't just about the rituals, it was about purifying our hearts before the Lord. With the temple restored and our hearts renewed, the assembly was invited to bring their own personal offerings. After all, the temple was not just a place for sacrifices, but also a place for each individual to connect with God. Thus, worship was restored and our faith shone once again. Life in ancient times could be a real roller coaster, couldn't it? Just imagine having to deal with the pressure of maintaining a huge army, feeding them, arming them. It was too costly. And look at what happened to the farmers. Often they were forced to sell their produce for a pittance just to support the royal army. Then came this guy, Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, with his whole army, and they weren't playing around. They climbed mountains, crossed lands until they reached Jerusalem. And look, they stopped right near a vital water source for the city, as if they had everything under control. When I heard about this, my heart froze. I sent some officials from my government to try to negotiate, but it was no use. Sennacherib didn't want peace, he wanted destruction. So we had to prepare for a siege. We ordered the water sources to be protected and rebuilt the city walls, reinforcing everything up to the towers. It was like we were gearing up for the worst. And then, the Assyrian commander told us their intentions. And well, it was a fight for survival. Look, Hezekiah, the great king of Assyria, has a message for you. He's wondering why you're so confident, speaking a bunch of empty words. He's acting like he's the big cheese, saying he has advice and strength for war, and he wants to know who you trust. He even says you've rebelled against him as if you're challenging his own authority. But here's the interesting part. He talks about trusting in Egypt, comparing it to holding onto a broken reed. He says if you just trust in Egypt, you're going to end up getting hurt. It seems like the Pharaoh of Egypt isn't as reliable as you might think, especially after taking a beating at Tycho. The Assyrian officers, the raps, were already expecting this response from you. They even say that if you can't trust Egypt, that's fine, but you should trust in the Lord, your God. They bring up those reforms you made in Judah, destroying the altars and all. It seems like they're trying to mess with your head, saying that God might be angry with you because of that. They even point out all the places where the people used to worship the Lord, implying that you might have disappointed God himself. And that's when things get tense, isn't it? It's a test of your faith and your leadership. Look, ever since Hezekiah took power, we've been facing a series of challenges. Now it feels like we're backed against the wall. The Lord God of Israel must be pretty angry with us, at least that's what some are saying. The enemy is using smart tactics to demoralize us, sending more powerful armies and pressuring us to surrender. The king of Assyria, that guy Sennacherib, is acting like the king of threats. He could easily march to Jerusalem and wipe us out, but instead, he prefers to try to make us give up with words. He offers a kind of bogus deal, saying if we surrender, he'll give us 2,000 horses. It sounds tempting, but we know we can't trust him. The Rabshakeh, that Assyrian commander, keeps on with his provocations. He mocks our relatively small army, saying that even if we got help, it would be useless. It's like he's challenging us, saying he could defeat us with one hand tied behind his back. The situation is tense, my friend. My people are worried, sitting on the walls and listening to these taunts. Dealing with all of this is hard enough, but the worst part is that the Rabshakeh is speaking in Hebrew, so everyone understands. Soon, discouragement could spread and force us to surrender. It's a test for our government. We need to keep hope and faith even when things seem bleak. It's time to show that we trust in the Lord, our God, to guide and protect us. These guys from the Assyrian army came up to the wall and started speaking in Aramaic, thinking we wouldn't understand. But of course, we did. Then they asked us not to speak in Hebrew, but it wasn't because they cared about our language. They just wanted to spread fear and discouragement. It was a real horror show. The Rabs, their officers, were there shouting loud, saying that the great king of Assyria meant business. They wanted us to give up trusting in Hezekiah, and even worse, to give up trusting in the Lord. They said Jerusalem had no salvation and that we should surrender. They even offered a deal, saying that if we surrendered, we could eat from our own crops and drink from our own water, as if it were a favor from them. They tried to convince us that it was better to accept defeat than to continue resisting. But Hezekiah didn't waver. He encouraged us to trust in the Lord even when things seemed bleak. He reminded us that the Lord would deliver us and that we shouldn't fall into the enemy's traps. It was a tough situation, but we can't lose faith. Even in the face of threats and provocations, we need to trust that the Lord is with us. That's what will give us the strength to resist and prevail. We had a really complicated situation here. This rabbi came with a speech all designed to glorify the enemy we're facing. He wanted to leave the people of God full of doubts about their leaders. The rabbi's speech was like an attempt to sow fear and uncertainty in people's hearts, trying to convince them that surrendering would be the best option. This guy Rabshakeh also got involved, talking about the Assyrians' terrible policies of forced resettlement. They defeat a people and then force them to move to other lands just to keep their morale down and their power intact. It was an attempt to paint this terrible situation as something redeeming. But look, the people of Jerusalem didn't fall for it. They remained silent without responding because I asked them not to. Sometimes it's futile and even dangerous to try to argue with this kind of evil logic. It's wiser to stay calm and trust in God than to get into an endless dispute. Israel's protection doesn't depend solely on walls and shields, you know? It also depends on the courage and resolution of our soldiers. That's what keeps us steadfast, even in the face of threats and intimidating speeches. Look, the situation here in Jerusalem got really tense. Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah came to me with their clothes torn, a clear sign of mourning and despair. They told me everything that this guy Rab had said, and it sent shivers down my spine. As soon as I heard, I tore my own clothes and dressed myself in sackcloth, that rough cloth, as a sign of deep mourning. It was a traditional way of expressing extreme sadness, and the situation demanded it. Jerusalem was in trouble, one city after another falling into the hands of Sennacherib. People were being deported, a bleak scenario was unfolding. Faced with this, I knew I needed to seek help from the Lord. There was no other way. I sent Eliakim, Shebna, and the elders of the priests to speak with the prophet Isaiah, a man of God. I asked them to convey to Isaiah a message that expressed all the anguish and despair we were facing. It was a cry for help, a plea for mercy. I knew the Lord would hear our words and that somehow He would help us. The hope we had left was that God would be outraged by the insults uttered by Rabshakeh and would punish him for his blasphemous words. It was difficult to maintain faith in the face of so much adversity, but it was all we had. This speech by Rabshakeh was an affront to God Himself, and we hoped He would act in our favor. So, I sent my servants to go speak to Isaiah. He told them to reassure me not to worry about the insulting words we heard from the people of the king of Assyria. Isaiah said that God would handle the situation, putting a spirit of confusion on the Assyrian king, causing him to hurry back to his land and ultimately fall by the sword. Isaiah spoke this as a true prophet of the Lord, confident that his words would come to pass. He knew he was risking his reputation as a prophet because this prophecy was something that would either come true or not. But it gave me comfort knowing that the words of Rabshakeh were just empty words. I didn't need to fear them. And then, look, the Lord really took these insults seriously. He summoned the Rabs and other officials of the Assyrian army. Meanwhile, Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria fighting against the city of Libnah in Judah. While he was away, the Assyrians learned that Egyptian troops, led by an Ethiopian king, were approaching from the south. It was the intervention many in Judah had hoped for, but as Isaiah predicted, it came to nothing, despite the hopes. You know, the Assyrians tried to discourage me from afar. I received a letter from them, an intimidating message saying that I shouldn't trust in my God. They mocked our faith, saying that Jerusalem would be delivered into the hands of the king of Assyria as if it were a certainty. They even listed all the cities they had already conquered, openly challenging the power of God. When I received this letter, I went up to the house of the Lord and spread it out before Him. I prayed with all my soul, crying out to the God of Israel, the one who is above all the kingdoms of the earth. I said, Lord, hear these insulting words of Sennacherib, who dared to defy the living God. You are the one true God, the creator of the heavens and the earth. Open your eyes and see this blasphemy. I acknowledged before the Lord that yes, the Assyrians had caused devastation wherever they went, but that didn't mean they had any real power. They destroyed the gods of other nations because they were made by human hands, mere objects of wood and stone. And now, Lord, I ask you, save me from this threat. Show the world that you are the true and mighty God. Listen, the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, sent me a message directly from the Lord, the God of Israel. He said he heard my prayers about Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. And then, just look at what the Lord spoke against him. It was simply powerful. The Lord said that the virgin daughter of Zion, Jerusalem herself, is mocking Sennacherib. She is shaking her head, laughing at his pride and insulting him. Who does Sennacherib think he is to challenge the Holy One of Israel? He boasts of his chariots and his conquests, cutting down cedars in Lebanon and drying up rivers in Egypt. But the Lord has known about this guy for a long time. He is about to use Sennacherib as an instrument to show his power. He will turn fortified cities into heaps of ruins, leaving Sennacherib and his followers powerless and ashamed. They will be like plants in the field, withering under the heat of the sun. And there's more. The Lord says he will put a hook in Sennacherib's nose and a bit in his mouth, causing him to return to Assyria with his tail between his legs. And to prove that this will happen, the Lord gave me a sign. This year, Sennacherib will eat what grows by itself. Next year, what springs up spontaneously, and in the third year, he will plant and harvest. That is the promise of the Lord, and he always keeps his promises. Check this out. the Lord promised that the remnant of Judah would strengthen and flourish again. A group of survivors will take root in Judah and they will grow and thrive. This is all the work of the Lord of hosts. And the Lord also sent a direct message to the king of Assyria: you will not even come near the city. You will not shoot an arrow, nor will you raise a shield, nor build a siege ramp against it. You will return by the same way you came, for I am defending this city for my sake and in honor of my servant David. And you know what happened? That very night, the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Can you imagine, all at once? This mighty army was defeated without even having the chance to shoot an arrow. God defended Jerusalem and showed his power against the invincible Sennacherib. This victory shows that God can make the impossible happen. He wiped out an entire army with a single blow from his angel. It's incredible how he takes care of us, isn't it? Just think, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers? Poof! Dead in the blink of an eye. That's right, the Lord showed his power once again. The Assyrian king, like Goliath, who defied the Lord, got a beating. Sennacherib, the all-powerful king of Assyria, had to tuck his tail between his legs and go back home. And you know what else? He couldn't even conquer Jerusalem. But here's the thing. Even though he failed, he still had a record made of his glorious conquests in Judah. But then, while he was there, all pompous, offering his prayers to his God, his own sons, Adramelech and Sharezer, stuck a sword in him. Sennacherib kicked the bucket, and his son, Esarhaddon, took the throne. But then comes the part where things got serious for me. Just imagine, God himself came to say, "Yeah, Hezekiah, your time has come. Get your house in order, man, because it's the end of the line for you." That caught me off guard, man. I was sick, really bad, and the prophet Isaiah came to give me the news. Man, it's not every day you get a message like that, right? I was stunned, and I sent up a prayer to the Lord. Look, I had a really intense moment with God. I asked him to guide me with sincerity and a faithful heart, and I did everything to do what he thought was right. I cried buckets, you know? It was a direct prayer to God. I wasn't talking to anyone else there. Even though God wanted my life just for him, I knew I could ask for a second chance. And then Isaiah came again, after going out and coming back, with some good news. Hey, God heard your prayers, saw your tears, and he's going to heal you. In 3 days, you'll be up and about, and you'll even gain another 15 years of life. Then he said for me to put some sort of fig poultice on the wound. I did that, and man, I recovered real quick. God gave me 2 big gifts, a longer life and the certainty that I have 15 more years ahead. And so, my friend, that's my story.